Hi, everyone. I'm Thérèse, and this is New York Girl Again, The After, the podcast for caregivers who have survived the hardest chapter of their lives and are now gathering both the courage and the strength to write the next one. Today, I want to talk about something that many caregivers completely lose somewhere along the way. I'm not talking about love or strength or resilience. I'm talking about self-compassion. Because if there is one thing I've learned in the after, it's that many caregivers know how to extend extraordinary compassion to everyone except themselves. We will ignore our own pain, push through exhaustion, sacrifice our bodies, sacrifice relationships, sacrifice dreams, and somehow still speak to ourselves with a level of cruelty we would never direct toward another human being. Especially after caregiving ends. Especially when the silence arrives. Especially when the adrenaline wears off and we finally have enough stillness to hear the way we've been talking to ourselves all along. And for many former caregivers, that inner voice is brutal. You should be further along by now. You're falling apart. You're too emotional. You're too much. You should be grateful. You should be over this already. You wasted so many years. You're weak. You're behind. You're failing. And maybe the hardest one of all, why can't you just move on? But what if part of healing in the after is finally learning how to stop abandoning yourself? I think a lot of people misunderstand self-compassion. They think it means becoming soft or passive, making excuses, or feeling sorry for yourself. But psychologically, that's not what it is at all. In fact, one of the world's leading researchers on self-compassion, Dr. Kristen Neff, defines it as treating yourself with the same kindness, understanding, and humanity that you would offer to someone you deeply love. And that sounds simple until you realize how differently most caregivers treat themselves. Because caregiving often trains us into hyper-responsibility. Your nervous system becomes conditioned to monitor danger constantly, to anticipate needs constantly, to always stay alert. And over time, many caregivers begin believing their worth is tied to how much they can endure, how much they can carry, how much they can survive without needing anything themselves. So when caregiving ends, instead of collapsing into compassion, many people collapse into criticism. Because suddenly, there is no mission anymore. No emergency, no role, no constant validation through usefulness. And underneath all of that exhaustion, many caregivers discover they have absolutely no idea how to be gentle with themselves. So why does self-compassion matter so much? There is significant research showing that self-compassion affects stress hormone regulation, anxiety levels, depression, inflammation, emotional resilience, nervous system regulation, and even heart rate variability. People with higher levels of self-compassion consistently show lower levels of anxiety and depression and greater emotional resilience during adversity. That makes complete sense to me, because many caregivers spend years living in survival mode. And survival mode changes the brain. Your body learns urgency, hypervigilance, overfunctioning, anticipating loss, and anticipating crisis. Many caregivers become extraordinarily compassionate externally, while internally functioning almost like emotional drill sergeants toward themselves. I know that is how I talk to myself. And eventually, the nervous system breaks under the pressure. There's a reason so many caregivers enter the after emotionally exhausted, physically depleted, inflamed, anxious, depressed, disconnected from joy, or unable to rest without guilt. Your body was never meant to live in chronic emotional emergency for years. And one of the things researchers continue finding is that self-compassion actually helps deactivate parts of the threat response system. It creates safety internally, which matters deeply after caregiving, because so many former caregivers no longer feel safe inside themselves. One of the things I think is important to understand is that self-compassion is not just emotionally comforting. It's psychologically regulating, meaning it actually changes the internal environment your mind and body are functioning inside of. And that matters enormously after caregiving, because many former caregivers are trying to heal while still internally attacking themselves every day. And psychologically, that creates a contradiction. You can heal in an environment where you are constantly emotionally unsafe with yourself. And this is where mindfulness becomes incredibly important. Because mindfulness is not just meditation. It's awareness without immediate judgment. It's learning how to notice your pain without instantly shaming yourself for having it. And caregivers are often terrible at this initially, because many of us became conditioned to override our own emotional reality for years. We learned to suppress exhaustion, resentment, grief, anger, loneliness, and fear. We became experts at functioning while emotionally flooded. But eventually, the body keeps score. And in the after, many caregivers suddenly find themselves emotionally overwhelmed because all the emotions that were postponed during survival began surfacing at once. This is where self-compassion and mindfulness begin working together psychologically. Mindfulness says, this is pain. Self-compassion says, and I deserve kindness while experiencing it. That combination is extraordinarily healing to the nervous system. Because psychologically, suffering intensifies when pain becomes fused with self-judgment. For example, pain says, I'm grieving. Self-judgment says, I should be over this. Pain says, I'm exhausted. Self-judgment says, you're weak. Pain says, I feel lost. Self-judgment says, you're failing. And what self-compassion does is it interrupts that second wound. Because often the deepest suffering isn't just the original grief. It's the brutality with which people respond to themselves afterward. And this is also where patience becomes essential. Because caregivers are often conditioned toward urgency. Fix it, handle it, solve it, push through it, keep moving. But emotional healing does not respond well to force. You cannot shame yourself into peace. And many caregivers become frustrated because they expect themselves to emotionally recover with the same efficiency they once managed crises. But grief, identity reconstruction, nervous system recovery, rediscovering joy, rebuilding self-worth, these things move slowly, like physical rehabilitation after an injury. And psychologically, self-compassion creates the conditions necessary for sustainable healing because it reduces emotional resistance. Instead of fighting yourself constantly, you begin working with yourself, and that changes everything. Research even shows that self-compassionate people are actually more motivated long-term than highly self-critical people, which surprises many people because we often believe criticism creates discipline. But psychologically, excessive self-criticism more often creates paralysis, avoidance, shame, anxiety, emotional exhaustion, and hopelessness. Compassion creates safety. Safety creates regulation, and regulation creates resilience. And resilience, real resilience, is not becoming emotionally numb. It's becoming emotionally supported enough internally that you can keep moving forward without destroying yourself in the process. I also think many caregivers struggle with self-compassion because somewhere along the way, they confuse self-compassion with selfishness, especially women, especially long-term caregivers, because culturally, we often praise self-sacrifice. We glorify exhaustion. We glorify being the strong one. But we rarely teach people how to recover afterward. And we almost never teach caregivers that they are still human beings while caregiving. Not afterward. Not once they earn it. Now. You were never supposed to disappear completely inside someone else's needs. And yet, so many caregivers do, including me. I think one of the most painful parts of the after is realizing how long you neglected yourself while trying to save someone else. And then feeling ashamed for the consequences of that neglect. The weight gain, the exhaustion, the isolation, the depression, the loss of confidence, the resentment, the grief, the anger, the emotional numbness. But self-compassion asks a radically different question. Not, what's wrong with me? But instead, what happened to me? And psychologically, that shift matters enormously because shame shuts people down. Compassion helps people heal. I recently listened to Guy Winch's talk, How to Fix a Broken Heart. And one of the things that struck me most deeply was his explanation that heartbreak and emotional loss activate many of the same pain pathways in the brain as physical pain. Meaning heartbreak is not dramatic, it's neurologically real. And I think caregivers need to hear that because many former caregivers minimize their suffering constantly. Well, at least they're no longer suffering. Well, other people have it worse. Well, I should just be grateful. Meanwhile, their nervous systems are completely overwhelmed. Their identities have shattered. Their bodies are depleted. Their purpose collapsed overnight. And they're still trying to convince themselves they should somehow be functioning normally. Self-compassion interrupts that cycle. It says, of course this hurt you. Of course this changed you. Of course you're struggling. You are not weak because something painful hurt you. You are human. So how do we actually begin building self-compassion? Especially if it feels unnatural. Especially if your inner voice has been harsh for decades. First, start noticing how you speak to yourself. Because many caregivers say things internally that they would never say to another grieving human being. Imagine saying to a grieving friend, "You should be over this already. You're pathetic. You ruined your life. You're too emotional." You wouldn't. So why is it acceptable when directed inward? Second, begin separating productivity from worth. This one is huge in the after because caregivers often feel guilty resting, guilty enjoying life, guilty laughing or traveling, guilty focusing on themselves, as though suffering became morally tied to love. But your continued suffering is not proof of your devotion. Your loved one would not want your entire life buried beside them. Third, learn nervous system compassion, not just mental compassion. Your body may need compassion too. Sleep, movement, sunlight, water, gentleness, rest, nutrition, joy, music, dance, laughter, connection, touch. These are not luxuries after caregiving. They are rehabilitation. And fourth, and understand this one deeply, self-compassion is not letting yourself off the hook. It is creating the internal conditions necessary for healing and growth. Research actually shows self-compassion increases accountability and resilience more effectively than shame does. Because shame paralyzes and compassion stabilizes. And honestly, I think there's something sacred about self-compassion too. Because after caregiving, many people feel disconnected not only from themselves, but from God, from meaning, from joy, from life itself. You spend so long carrying suffering that eventually suffering begins to feel more familiar than peace. And sometimes learning self-compassion is actually learning how to believe you are still worthy of the tenderness, even after everything. Even after the grief and the trauma, after the mistakes, after the exhaustion, even after becoming someone you barely recognize for a while. I think many caregivers survive by becoming emotionally armored. But eventually, healing asks us to put some of that armor down because we deserve to experience life again, fully. So today, if nobody has told you this recently, you are allowed to speak to yourself gently. You are allowed to stop punishing yourself for what survival required. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to rebuild slowly. You are allowed to become someone new after caregiving. And most importantly, you are allowed to offer yourself the same compassion you gave so freely to everyone else. Because you are always worthy of receiving it too. And maybe that's part of what the after really is. Not just surviving what happened, but finally learning how to come home to yourself afterward. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. If this episode resonated with you, I would love for you to join our New York Girl Again community at newyorkgirlagain.com. and follow us on social media. And if you're feeling emotionally stuck, disconnected from yourself, or overwhelmed trying to figure out who you are after caregiving, I also offer one-to-one guided reset sessions through NewYorkGirlAgain.com. These sessions are designed to help former caregivers begin reconnecting with themselves again emotionally, mentally, physically, and spiritually after years of surviving. You do not have to navigate this part alone. Until next time, speak to yourself like someone worth saving.